Yeah, so my background is, as you mentioned, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and actually wrote my dissertation. I was a trainer, so I trained rides workers at Six Flags Astroworld, which was a theme park that has sadly closed in Houston, Texas. And I was at Rice doing my PhD and also working at the theme park, and that was in the late '90s. And in those days, I was primarily interested in the theme park from the perspective of how it operated as a service industry phenomenon. So the issues of management and training concepts and so forth. In the years since, as Tiffany mentioned, I became interested in more aspects of design, which is, I think, very relevant to your class and your projects. And then have had some unique opportunities over the years, writing books that began more in the academic realm. And then when I worked on the Immersive Worlds Handbook, that was an attempt to go really more into the realm of design and practice. And I've done consulting projects. So I led a workshop for Walt Disney Imagineering in Burbank, which was very enlightening. And as I mentioned to Tiffany in our conversation, as some of you probably know, when you do consulting and you sign NDAs or non-disclosure agreements, it becomes an issue because if you want to write about these things or present them, you really can't. And actually, I will, at some point with the class, I can share with you I have quite a few articles that are freely available on my academia.edu site. And I'm also redesigning my website in the next week or so, and I have a pretty extensive YouTube site. And I should say the YouTube site is trying to really get into the experiences of the guest going to a theme space. It could be a Las Vegas casino, it could be a theme park, it could be I find museums that focus on dark history and disturbing history to be particularly interesting. So in the last few years, I've worked more in this realm of trying to collaborate with architects and sensory designers. When I present at IAPA, I often work with people in the industry who do sensory design or architects, and so I'm trying to engage this research in more of these practical and applied perspectives. And I should say I'm also part of I recently did a lecture at Oxford. There's a new group starting up there. I think their funding is relatively small, but they're hoping to grow. And then also there's a current project I'm working in Germany on theme park studies, and we're producing a book that is each chapter essentially focuses on an aspect of studying theme parks. So there's a chapter on theming, there's a chapter on doing the research, and as I mentioned earlier with the research side of things, I find it hopeful that maybe we will engage in new forms of research, more experientially based, such that we're beyond maybe just thinking of theme parks or theme spaces in that traditional sense. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be critical of theme parks from perspectives of Marxism or cultural studies or gender studies, but I think that there's an opportunity to create some new collaborations between people doing the experiential design in the industry and then some of the academics studying the spaces that we all enjoy. So that's, I guess, a brief background of where I've come from, if that explains things. And I've often said in my work, you could see this in the Immersive Worlds Handbook, that side of experience, looking very closely at actors in these historical interpretive places, and those of you based in the UK or Europe, there are so many wonderful places and all sorts of communities of reenactment that are, I would say, go beyond theme design because it gets into the experience of how people perceive things as an actor. It also gets into the experience of the guest, of course, which I know Tiffany is looking at in her work. So what fascinated me with this program in experience design was that they were able to merge these academic worlds to have the depth, the history, the cultural issues, to make sure that you weren't doing something. I hate to use the example of tiki, but in my immersive reader, I just did a short piece on the culture of tiki and talking about the controversies of cultural appropriation I was just actually in one of my online classes on Canvas talking about this, where worldwide there's new emphasis, I believe, on sensitivity, not just in the worlds of design, but fashion, the culinary worlds, music, of course, where the concern is that you might create an event, you might create some space that has cultural, historical components to it, but you need to be sure that you're not going to offend, or you need to be sure that you are thinking very carefully, not just about the fabrication, the material issues, but you're thinking about experience and how people will experience the space. No, I think it's a very good good set of questions. I think that certainly coming from the world of cultural anthropology, a lot of the, I would say, within the humanities, a lot of disciplines, gender studies, I think there's an emphasis on looking at the complications of the theory practice or praxis divide. One of the issues you get into in cultural anthropology is that you're studying experience in the world. So you could go out and study a culture, you could learn about that culture, you could learn the language if it's a language different from your spoken language. And then at some point, you have to represent what you've learned in some form. And so the typical academic approach has been to write, at least for cultural anthropology, is to write what's called an ethnography. And an ethnography is a written document that purports to explain the experiences of a culture and to get them accurate and so forth. So the specific program I was involved in at Rice in the late 80s, there was a book that came out called Writing Culture. And this book was very critical of traditional anthropology, in part because the argument was made that ethnographers or anthropologists were claiming to represent a culture and all those experiences they had from practicing and learning about the culture and experiencing it. But the claim was made that when they represented the culture in a text, in an ethnography, maybe they got some things wrong. Perhaps they, in terms of their perspective, what we call in gender studies positionality, your view of the world, how you see the world with your lens as an experiencer of the world, that some mistakes were made or some political choices were made such that you gave a perspective of a culture that maybe we could question. So I think that what we call the crisis of representation in cultural anthropology certainly could be applied to these worlds of design. One of the things I try to do when I talk with people in the industry, with practitioners, is to have really open conversations and to say, well, do you think, like anthropologists talk about writing ethnography, when you design something for a theme park, that you could be critical of it in such a way that you see that you are indeed representing something. And I remember when I was at Europa Park in Germany some years back, doing an interview with an architect. He was just finishing the design. They had just opened their new Iceland theme land. And so I said to him, could you tell me about your design practice and how you came to create the spaces you did and what you did as a practitioner? And he was very transparent. And he said, well, I had to finish this project on time. And so I essentially Googled Iceland, and I used, some of the images I found on my Google search for my design. And I was somewhat shocked by that, but it was transparent, right? He was being, critical, but essentially what he was saying was, I had limitations, I had a deadline, maybe there were limitations in budget. And I think one of the things that we don't realize, maybe the academics who study theme parks and theme spaces, is that in terms of theory and practice, sometimes you have to create something on a short timeline. Unless you're Disney or Universal, you're limited by budget. And I think some of the people who do the designs that we're talking about in some cases would like to be more reflexive and would like to think critically about the practice that they're doing in terms of experience design. But those limitations are there in the design world that aren't necessarily there in the academic world. Of course, you're limited in the academic world by your travel budget and your, as Tiffany was talking about with her interviews, how many people will actually respond to your surveys. So I guess what I would say is, to answer the question in sum, I would say we should all be more critical of opportunities to look at what we're doing in terms of our practice, and then to focus back on theory or the foundations that we use to either design experiential worlds or events or to create foundations for our research. Hopefully, we can be critical and express some of our criticism in whatever venues possible. Now, I think in the design and experience worlds, it's very hard sometimes because of trade secrets and not wanting to give away, to the competition what you're doing. So if you're a corporation and you're too critical of your product, or you leave things open for question by the guest or something, if you show some of this kind of meta level of design like you see at Universal theme parks with some of the itchy and scratchy stuff with The Simpsons, it maybe doesn't play as well because, again, you can't necessarily show to the competition that transparency that I mentioned in doing the interview with the architect. Yeah, so I don't know if that answered it. It was kind of a roundabout way of answering your question, perhaps. World where I think there is maybe more awareness or reflexivity, as we call it, thinking about the limits of your designs and your representations materially, is probably in the world of museums. And I think that, particularly when I'm traveling in Europe, I find that a lot of times museums there will present information in such a way where maybe the guest can see that there are limitations. There are budgetary limitations. There are limitations of perspective. I can't tell you how many times in the States at the Smithsonian, particularly if there's warfare or a period of genocide, it's presented, but then other groups come forward and say, well, wait a second, you've presented this event in such a way suggesting that these people did this, or history happened this way when it really happened this way. And so I feel that in the world of museums and the kind of experience design generally in museums, that there are opportunities to think about the implications of your design, the research, the theory, the history, all that information that you bring to present to the public. So for me, that's a sign of new opportunities, and there is more and more fluidity between the worlds of museums and theme parks. So if you go to IAAPA, the big amusement industry conference, I frequently talk to museum studies people and theme park people. The Themed Entertainment Association, TIA, which has representations in Europe, Asia, and the States, also has that opportunity for conversations between worlds of theme parks and museums. So I wanted to mention the museum world because I think it does have a bearing on this conversation. Yeah, I think it's an important question. For the reading list, if you look at the work of Margaret King, many years ago, she was, I think, one of the first ones to write about this merging of the worlds of theme parks, and very specifically, she was looking at Disney and the world of museums. I think it's, these sorts of mutual influences have been in play for many years. The concept of edutainment, if you talk to academics, if you talk certainly to some people who are coming from the world of museums and maybe have a more traditional perspective, I think there's a concern, because the concern is that somehow if you're presenting your information, what you're designing, to the guest in the form of theme park technologies, then the perception is that the quality of the pedagogy, the quality of not the entertainment, the education is lessened for the sake of the entertainment, and hence we have the portamento word edutainment, combining education and entertainment. I think more and more, again, as I said earlier, if you go to industry conferences, you could have a panel of people from theme parks. I was at one in Orlando, the TIA conference, and I actually presented on a panel with Margaret King. We weren't really talking about this issue, but again, that's her background. But there was another conversation there between someone who worked at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago and someone from the world of theme parks. And so it was very natural, I think, that conversation. But if you spoke to maybe academics who don't know that the conference circuit and don't attend these professional industry conferences, they might be surprised by that. So I think if you talk to more and more people in the world of museums, they're aware of the fact that they are in competition, perhaps, with theme parks and other forms of entertainment that you find in physical spaces as well as in virtual spaces, competition from video games, competition from Netflix and online streaming media and so forth. I don't know if they would admit it, but they would acknowledge that that's part of what they do. I would say that if you learn from if you're working in museums and you take some of the approaches of theme parks and you incorporate that as part of your design, like I go to major museums, I visit them. Again, if you go to my YouTube site, you could see some of these. I was recently at a very small county museum in the state of Nevada in the United States. And, again, as you mentioned earlier, they were on a very limited budget. So I understood the design choices. But as I walked through the museum, I thought, oh, it's a little staid. It seems a little conservative. It seems very non-interactive. Now, part of me was thinking after I visited that museum, perhaps I've been conditioned by going to the big budget museums and going to theme parks and the World Exposition, which I visited in 2015 in Milan, Italy. So I feel like the stakes have been raised in terms of experience design. And, maybe if you're limited by budget, as I mentioned with the small museum I visited, then you don't have the ability to create interactive design. But I feel like there are opportunities to learn from both sides. The museum world could take some of the experiential technologies and engage guests while making the experience pedagogically and educationally meaningful. And I feel like theme parks could learn from the world of museums and can learn about maybe presenting more information and not just creating something for the sake of entertainment. The example of that would have been Walt Disney's America theme park, which was the Civil War theme park, which didn't happen because very much museum people and historians were against the idea of Disney creating something that would be maybe arguably more suited for a traditional museum in terms of the American Civil War. So I think there are opportunities for both the museum world and the theme park world to critically look at itself and to engage the other in some conversations about both entertainment and education as they have an impact on both of these worlds. There are other, museums that certainly present the Civil War, but the plan was, this was in the 90s, Disney wanted to create this theme park that would essentially be on the grounds of many of the Civil War battlefields in Manassas on the East Coast. And there was extensive testimony you can read. There was Senate testimony. There was a variety of concerns. It wasn't just the fact that Disney was focusing on the Civil War history, but there were also concerns about traffic and infrastructure and so forth. But in retrospect, so essentially there hasn't been a theme park that has done something like this. And I said in a lecture years ago in Germany that I think part of the controversy was it would be too dark because, of course, how do you present, issues of slavery and issues of a very political sort and topics of like genocide and dark history in the context of a theme park? And when Disney has done this in minute forms, if you go to Animal Kingdom, there are 2 or 3 rides where they deal with serious topics of ecology, of poaching, of deforestation, but it's very subtle. It's not the main part of the experience. I've argued in some of my work that I think it would be instructive if more theme parks would bring in these aspects of dark history, but I think it's just too dangerous to do because the theory is that guests will not want to spend, $100, $200 visiting a theme park and having a depressing experience. Now, you go to a museum, there's maybe more of an expectation. If you go to any of the Holocaust or genocide museums in the States and Europe, I think the expectation is that you're preparing yourself for this. So, yeah, essentially, it was a very bold uh, design, a bold concept, but it never came to be. So. I mean, very good, points on those experiences, and I guess I would say that my thought is, yes, you go into many museums, and there's an expectation that, it won't be a pleasant experience. It could be a dark experience. But I wonder, in the world of theme parks, if we'll see more of a trend moving towards some of these topics being addressed. And I think of this because if you look at the state of the world, you look at Europe, you look at the rise of nationalism, you look at what's happened in the United States with Trump, Brazil politically, we see sort of this movement backwards towards more totalitarianism and nationalism. And then if you look at climate, if you look at global warming, we live in the era of what many people call the Anthropocene, which is the era in which human impact on the Earth's ecosystems is extreme, perhaps at a point of no return. So I feel that if the trends continue in the bigger world, I don't think theme parks and theme spaces, even casinos, can be blind to this. I think maybe they have to engage in the conversation. One example of this, which is very, I think, kind of a strange example, I was on a cruise ship years ago, and cruise ship, just from a technology standpoint, if you look at it, you would say it's not very ecologically sound. All the fuel that's consumed and all the resources, the waste. Well, on this cruise ship, on one deck, a very little event they had, not an event, but a room with video screens. It was called Team Earth, and the idea was that people could get on these computer screens, and the room was covered in images of nature and all sorts of wild animals and ecosystems. And you were supposed to get on these computers, and you could calculate your carbon footprint. So you could type in, your daily life and how often you commute to work with your automobile and airplanes and all this. But the strange thing about it was, and I thought maybe it was a metaphor, was like half of the computer screens weren't working. So I left this experience thinking it's a very strange thing to be on a cruise ship, which is not very ecologically sound, and to be told by the people who created this Team Earth lab that you should calculate your carbon footprint. And it almost made me think like anyone who did that would immediately feel guilty in the first place for being on a cruise ship, because of course a cruise ship is not very sound in terms of its impact on the environment. So to go back to ethics, to go back to politics, I wonder if the future of design, even in the worlds of theme parks and theme spaces, casinos, for example, will have to mention the outside world. If you're creating a world of fantasy, to what extent will you mention that in the topics, the content that you design? So perhaps we'll see a future where it's not only the museum world that's engaging in some of these topics that we're talking about. Yeah, it makes me. I was just going to say, I wrote a piece. Again, you can look on my academia site on immersion, and I essentially asked some of the questions you're asking. I said, if someone is immersed in, we call them cults. Sometimes we call them um, uh, sort of high intensity groups or high demand groups, religions. If someone's part of a religion or extreme political movement where they have to give up a lot and they sort of become, quote, brainwashed, I think we're very critical of that. And we talk about deprogramming, or if someone's an alcoholic or has an addiction. But in this piece, I question even the basis of immersion. And I say, is it okay? I mean, if you're, a video gamer and you're spending 15 hours of your day, you're not sleeping, you're not eating, you're not doing anything, you're just playing some immersive video game, is that ethical? And likewise, I think when we talk about theme parks, or we talk about some of these themed experiences in casinos, if they're promoting certain values, how do we engage those worlds? How do we, I mean, casinos have to, at least in Nevada, in Las Vegas, they have to put signs that say, if you have a gambling problem, please call this number. Now, of course, the one side of that is they realize that they, to some extent, rely upon people gambling to make their money, right? And but on the other hand, there's also this acknowledgement that maybe they're going too far. So I think when we talk about how people experience these worlds that we design, maybe we need to be conscious of the fact that it's not always acceptable or it's not always ethical for someone to be immersed, maybe to certain extents in certain levels of content, in certain levels of time, if they're spending too much time immersing themselves in one of these worlds. And so I think it's really challenging. And by the way, it's very challenging for the retailers who have brick and mortar spaces to get people to actually come to their spaces, because I think so many people, as we're doing right now virtually, we're engaged in virtual worlds, in immersive worlds online, in video games. We'll see what happens with augmented reality, because there's still a question, I think, about whether augmented reality and virtual reality will have the level of impact that it might on physical spaces. But I think these are all important questions to ask ourselves, what are the consequences of immersing ourselves in any of these worlds that we're talking about? Oh, I think absolutely. In fact, I'm teaching a visual anthropology class, and we just did a segment on this topic of Instagram and filters. And my students were very critical. They felt exactly as you're saying, that we shouldn't live in this reality, or this hyper reality, where we take a picture of ourselves and we run it through a process, through a filter, and we present it to the world because we're disappointed with how we look. So a lot of these issues that we're talking about here in terms of hyper reality, I think they're applicable not just to the worlds that we're talking about with theme spaces and event spaces, but they're also applicable to social media. And of course, cultural anthropologists would say that these worlds are all interconnected. So what we do on Instagram, what we do on Facebook, on social media, impacts how we design spaces. When I go to a Disney theme park now, it's a little uncanny, and I think I was talking with Tiffany about this on our chat, where I see so many people on their phones. And so on the one hand, you realize as a designer of theme park spaces, you have to design for the phones. So maybe you create a game. I saw a lot of this at the World Expo in Milan, where you would take your phone and you would do things where you would check in, or you would capture creatures, kind of like with Pokemon or something like this with a video game. And so you were acknowledging that social media world exists and you have to play to it. But on the other hand, I feel that as a child, when I went to Disney theme parks, looking back at it, I don't think it would have been as meaningful had I experienced it using a phone. And I think it's a problem where that world has, in a sense, invaded a little bit how you create your theme spaces and how you design for those experiences. So that's kind of another issue there. But to go back to hyper reality, as we talked about with dark history, I think there's an importance here for us to think about when we design a space for a guest. Maybe we're going too far in terms of how we're creating some of these worlds, such that there's too much escapism and we don't give opportunities for people to, this is going to sound maybe a little corny or something, but we don't give opportunities for people to feel a sense of authenticity, because we're telling them they have to be a certain way. And that's always the challenge with consumer spaces, because the emphasis is not necessarily on telling a person that they should be authentic or civically minded or a good citizen or a good person. We're often telling people they should be a consumer. They should shop, they should purchase, they should buy, which goes back to the issue of having a gift shop in a museum of dark history. So I feel like there are a lot of issues there that probably stem from the fact that we are having this conversation existing within a consumer society that a lot of these experiences are designed for. Well, we can go back to the Tiffany knows about in Disney theme parks, right, where you had the Kodak picture spot, where we said, oh, you could and this was before the age of social media. But you're right, in the age of social media, when I was in Singapore, they had specific attractions that were designed to interface with Facebook or YouTube. So it's here for sure. No, it's a great question, and I think in the world of museums, there was the whole movement, that book, Museum 2.0, the idea that the guest is leaving an imprint, is, as you said, it's being a co-creator, is having a conversation, and I feel like in the world of museums, even popular museums. I was at, of all places, the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, and certainly the mob, you could say, and organized crime. It's very dark, the mafia, and they played on some of that darkness, but also some of it was quite entertaining. But there was a section where you could actually leave via video, or audio. You could leave your impressions if your family was impacted by organized crime or whatever. And they had a pretty expansive definition of organized crime that included, the global drug trade and even counterfeit electronics and copyrighted goods. But I found that that was interesting because I wasn't expecting it, because this museum was geared a little more at more the popular side, because it was in Las Vegas, and just the design they created in the museum was very much focused on a more popular, as opposed to, say, a dark portrayal of organized crime. But I think that idea of co-creation, we expect it maybe in museums, because we hope that it's not just the passive guest walking through the museum, experiencing things. Hopefully he or she, particularly if it's a museum of genocide or dark history, will take a position and will be changed by the experience. Now, again, in a consumer space, I think maybe cynically, the expectation isn't that the guest is going to leave the space and do good things in their community. There are some exceptions. I think if you go to Animal Kingdom, the Disney theme park, they do try to express to the guests the value of making some smart choices in terms of their behaviors, so that they don't harm animals and their ecosystems. But I've said in some of my work that I hope that more designers of spaces will leave the opportunity for the guest to leave an imprint on the space and to co-create as much as is possible. There's a challenge there. If you leave an opportunity for the guest to co-create the experience and even leave a comment or something like this during the experience, someone can leave a tawdry comment. They can maybe present something that is too outside the line of how you think about the experience, your brand, your worldview, your cosmology. But I would say more and more there are opportunities for this. More theoretically, in anthropology, we talk about the anthropologist co-creating an ethnographic text with informants, with people that you study in the field. The late Italian theoretician Umberto Eco wrote an important book called The Open Work, where he said we need to think about, as writers, creating texts that are not author-based texts, but are more reader-based texts. And so I think if you apply that to experience design, you would give the guest opportunities to leave their imprint. Again, there's a danger in doing that, because if you're a company like Disney or Universal, do you really want to leave your experience open to change? What if you don't like the direction of what people are saying? It happens all the time in the United States, in the world of social media and journalism, where you have hate groups or extremist groups expressing things, and then it could change the course of the election, as we discovered with Russian interference in Facebook. So I think leaving opportunities open for guest co-participation or co-creation is a great idea. But for the big players who are known for controlling their brands and their identities, like Disney, Universal, I don't know if they'd be so open to that. And I could be wrong on this, so I don't know. Yeah, I was thinking achieving in a physical three-dimensional space the design approach of a video game that's, an open world, a so-called sandbox world experience, obviously would be impossible. You could augment with virtual reality and augmented reality, but as you're saying, there's still design choices. You can't, unless you get into artificial intelligence. And I'm thinking of, there was a panel at, it was either Tia or IAPA on Westworld, if you know the show on American cinema on HBO. Westworld's an interesting fictional, I think, ideal maybe, and it's of course a dystopian reality. But Westworld, fictionally, I think, is the example of a true open world sandbox experience in a physical, three-dimensional space. Now, again, it would be someone. I read an article online. Someone did an estimation of how much Westworld would cost if you could really create it, and it was, $1 trillion or something like this. It was very expensive, and obviously we don't have robotics that can do what the robots do in Westworld. And again, it's a dystopian reality, but I think it would be interesting to imagine, more open worlds or more opportunities for guests to have some kind of participation that doesn't seem predetermined. Because again, even as you're saying, the Indiana Jones ride where there are three possible endings, it's still only three possible endings. So I don't know if that's really co-creation in the sense that your class is talking about co-creation. Maybe not. I don't know. Yeah, I think, the bringing up community events, I think if there's a community expectation, if you're doing something as a community, and that could even be in a virtual sense perhaps, then I think from the beginning there's a shared identity or foundation. What's curious about most consumer spaces going to a theme park is our relationship to other people in those spaces. It's defined as what sociologists call an aggregate. So an aggregate is go to a restaurant, a fast food restaurant, you stand in line, you're all there because you want to eat the fast food, but presumably there won't be a community focus there. You won't have a conversation about politics, or you won't engage as you would as members of a community. So I think the context of the space, again, really matters. Where I see some of this happening in terms of co-creation and maybe a civic-minded approach are at the spaces at the World Exposition. There was one pavilion in particular when I visited Milan in 2015. It was the Swiss Pavilion, and the Swiss Pavilion was the entire theme of the expo in 2015 was on food and sustainability. So it had a civic or politically minded value to it from the beginning. But what the Swiss Pavilion did, it was created with towers, and I have some videos on my YouTube side of it talking about the experience. And these towers held four food items: apple, water, coffee, and salt. And there was a lecture at the beginning by a docent, essentially, and they talked about how the four food items were chosen because of their connection to Swiss food identity. And the idea was that as a guest in the space, you could take any of the four items. They didn't tell you how much coffee you could take, how much water, how much salt. Over the course of the 6 months of the expo, physically you could visually see the containers of each of the four items. They started at the top of the four towers and they went to the bottom. At the same time, you could visually see this. You could go online and you could look at the app, the web portal, and the web portal showed you how much depletion of each of these items happened over time. And as the expo went on over a period of months, eventually all the food items ran out. And what I thought was brilliant about this presentation was that it was, I think, an example of putting the guest in the picture, because the creators of the experience said, you have a choice. You have a choice. If you want to take any of the four items, you could take as much as you want, or you could leave it for future people to have. And so I felt like conceptually it left the guest in such a way that he or she thought about the choices that were being made. And I also thought just visually, and bringing in the web portal was another great opportunity to show that you could create spaces that are both physical, brick and mortar spaces, and also are spaces that use an internet portal or a virtual opportunity for people to connect if they're not actually in that
Mm.
space. I would just say to the
Mm.
class, if you can, the next one in 2020 is in Dubai, the next World Expo. They do every a few years. They also do a smaller one. There was one in Kazakhstan, I think, recently. But yeah, I really encourage you to go because you see amazing design, but you also see the stuff we're talking about, more the civically minded, participatory, some of the dark history stuff we've talked about. So I really recommend going. I think it's an important experience just to see what issues are out there and how people think about designing these. It's a maddening experience because you have, hundreds of pavilions, and as you're saying, the lines can be, I think some of the lines in Milan were 4 hours long. I mean, it's
Mm.
definitely a grueling experience if you go there as a researcher, but it's well worth it. I definitely would recommend going to an expo in the future. Yeah, no, I think one of the things I was thinking about in this topic was there was an article, I forget the source, but recently someone on an Imagineer I know posted this on social media, and it was saying essentially, we thought virtual reality and augmented reality would come to impact themed and immersive spaces. And the argument was being made that there is an impact, but maybe it's not the type of impact we imagine. I mean, for example, I know more and more theme parks are taking a roller coaster and they're giving someone, Google glasses of some form and saying, okay, you can experience a new reality. So physically, you feel the movement of the roller coaster, and then virtually, you're experiencing a different reality. So that, fluidity of the world of video games and physical experiences, I think, is coming to play. But I wonder, and I even felt this when I was at the expo in Milan. Sometimes there would be a device or a use of your phone, but it seemed to me very novel. Like it didn't necessarily take the experience into new conceptual realms. It added to the experience, but it didn't necessarily make it new. And I just wonder if that will change. You go to museums and sometimes they have an experience where you put on virtual reality glasses, and it's very interesting. But then it almost seems like I can't express it, very like superficial, right? Like what I want to happen, I guess, is more that technology will be part of the experience, transforming it in some way conceptually, instead of just making a new novel way of experiencing the reality of the space. I think that's a great opportunity. In fact, I know that in the worlds of palliative care, medicine, in dementia, Alzheimer's care, there's movement more towards this technology that you're describing, maybe using forms of augmented virtual reality as a form of therapy, a therapeutic intervention. I also know that they've talked about this sort of design, not in terms of medicine, but in terms of people living in spaces that are particularly small in large cities. You could maybe, through the use of virtual reality windows of some sort, create an experience that, as you're saying, it brings the experience to them. So it allows you to travel maybe without traveling. So using augmented reality to create a different sort of living space for yourself. So, but as you mentioned, I think the most interesting are maybe the uses of this technology for creating virtual worlds for some form of therapy or medical intervention. I think it's a very important opportunity there for those communities. Yeah, and I think it's important, when you're designing any experience to think about all communities. I think not just in terms of disability, but just people who have different viewpoints. And if you're presenting an experience that's only geared at one population, you're really not doing your job. You're really not thinking about the multiple communities that will experience what you're designing. And maybe a lesson there is that in virtual design, you can, if it's a software choice, you can make more opportunities available to wider communities. But in terms of physical spaces, certainly you have to think about issues of accessibility and how guests experience a space. If it's a certain physical experience and there are going to be limitations for some guests, then I think you have to think about redesigning or starting over in terms of your design, because it's not an inclusive space. Yeah, I guess one conversation for the future is, and I mentioned this to Tiffany when we had our chat, that there's two trends I think that maybe are impacting immersion. One is the movement towards IP. So the fact that many of the big theme park players, Disney, Universal, it's the movement more towards theming that is based on a transmedia property. So it's Harry Potter, it's Star Wars, and it's Avatar. So that's like one trend to think about. And I actually think it could be a problem for the industry, because I think that maybe not all guests want to experience continually in all media forms Harry Potter. They read the books, they watch the movies. Do they need the theme park? Now, again, some people will disagree with me on that. And then the second thing is related to that. It's the moving towards new forms of immersion. I mentioned Westworld, the fictional world, earlier, but Disney has plans to create Galaxy's Edge, which will be a 2-day immersive hotel experience. And I did an interview on this recently for online travel journal. And I was saying, this is maybe the future. If you have the money of a Disney, you can do something like this where you will actually play a role. It'll be more like you're in a theater show. I know these are kind of big in London. There's a lot of experiences, where you do a 1-day experience that is themed a certain way, and there's a dinner and a performance, and even maybe a mystery adventure, a clue hunt, or something like this. So I'm also suggesting that maybe this is the trend, is moving more towards longer immersive experiences, and their experiences that will be more in depth in terms of their immersion. So those would be just the two trends I guess I would leave with you today.